Hi, welcome to The Witch in the Woods, and today I want to talk about cunning folk, Spae wives, horse whisperers and toadmen. So from around the 16th century well into the 19th century, we have records of people who would call themselves cunning folk. Alternatively, they were called Spae wives, or in Cornwall they were called pellers. And a cunning person was the antithesis of a witch, whereas a witch was considered a malevolent practitioner. A cunning person was in fact a wise practitioner, a white magician, somebody who would be beneficial and who would help to heal and bring about good magic for others. So they would offer their services as fortune tellers and as healers and as midwives. But they would also offer such services as exposing thieves and finding lost objects and turning away the baneful magic of malevolent witches. And so these people were not considered to be as bad as a witch. In fact, they say that the witch burnings passed many of these people by, and because they were considered to be beneficial people. So as a result, cunning people actually practiced well into the 19th and even 20th centuries, and we have records of their deeds and of their actions. In fact, many cunning people would practice under a guise of Christianity. Not all of them, but many did, and would use Christian liturgy, invoking saints and Christian angels in their prayers and in their spells. In fact, some of them would attend church on a Sunday and then sell their spells as practitioners of magic to the villagers for the rest of the week. So every village was said to have a cunning man and woman. In fact, possibly more than one. And there were secret societies that would pass on initiations into such magical practices. Now, we know of some of the trade guilds, but there's no reason to assume that there weren't also covens of cunning people and societies of cunning people who would teach each other. So every trade had a guild, and many of these guilds would pass on secret initiations and secret powers. The most famous of these guilds, of course, is the Freemasons that we've heard of today. But every trade had guilds, such as baking, milling, ploughing, cattle trading, and horsemanship. So in many ways, what these witches, well, we can't call them witches, just hello. Archie, if you're going to snore and you're going to make noises, look cute, look at the little ball. Look at the camera. Okay. Big, you snoring. Oh. Okay, tail out of shot, please. Tail. Tail in shot. Can you settle down, babe? That's... Oh, here goes the baby screaming. So in many ways, these cunning people carried on the tradition of the vulva, or the Nordic witch. And what we know of them is very little, but it is believed that they continued on in Scotland under the... Can you just sit? Look, just sit there. Good boy. It's hard enough as it is, yes. So in many ways, these practitioners carried on the role of what we might call the Nordic Vulva, or the Nordic Witch. And they would offer their services of offering prophecies, or finding lost objects, or offering healing. So it said in Scotland that the Vulvas continued under the title of Spae wives. And Spae wives were actually very well respected members of the community. And it was said that they would go through an initiation that was passed on orally through generations to take on this role of Spae wife or healer. Now, we know a little of their initiations through the works of a man called Walter Traill Denison, and he was a folklorist who recorded the folklore of the Orkneys in 1880s, and he actually wrote down the ritual that a woman would do to become a Spae wife. And what he wrote down was that the ritual was performed on a full moon. I wish this cat would settle down. So he recorded that the ritual that bestowed power on the Spae wife took place on a full moon. And the initiate would go alone to a beach and would turn thrice anti-clockwise and then lay down on the beach somewhere between the low tide and the shore. So on that part of the beach that was neither land nor sea, it was a liminal place. And these liminal places were commonly believed to be magical places, something that was either neither one thing or the other. And this is quite a common theme. We see it in fairy tales, where a person must be neither this nor that, so neither dressed nor naked, neither alone or with company. It's also seen in the rites of the Druids that were recorded as prophesying with one foot raised and one arm behind their back, and I think it was one eye closed. So it's one of these things that is neither this nor that. So the initiate would lie down on a beach between the lowest point of the tide and the highest point of the tide. And they would take 7 stones and, spreading their arms and their legs outright, they would place 2 stones at their feet, 2 stones at their hands, 1 stone at their head, 1 stone on their chest and 1 stone on their hearts. They would then say a kind of charm or prayer, which Walter Traill Denison records as being: "O Mr. King at all that's ill, come fill me with the warlock's skill, and I shall serve with all my will. T'll take me gin or sinno, t'll take me gin or winno, t'll take me winno kinno. Come take me now and take me all, take lightsome liver pluck and gal. Take me new I say, for the how of the head to the tip of the tay. Take all that's outen in me, take hair and hide nigh to thee. Take heart and hands, flesh, blood and bones, take all atween the 7 stains, in the name of the muckle black wallower." So many people have interpreted this character of the wallower being a Scots dialect word for the devil, and it's true that in some areas of Scotland the devil is called wallower. But it's also been conjectured that this is a later addition, said to give the charm a rather malevolent flavour, and in fact the term wallower bears a strong resemblance to the word vulva, and originally this charm may have in some way invoked the Dark Witch or the Dark Goddess. So after repeating this incantation, the initiate would then turn over on their left hand side and get up and take each of the 7 stones and throw them into the sea with what Traill Denison calls a malediction. Now, we don't exactly know what he meant by a malediction, but this reminds me of a ceremony I read about where one takes 7 stones and throws them at an obelisk. And this is to purify yourself and rid yourself of some kind of baneful harm. So with each stone that is thrown, you would throw a curse away, you would throw something difficult or harmful away, or curse or swear. And this was just to purge yourself of these things. So I imagine it was in some ways a little like that. Oh, it's gone very dark, it's going to rain. So the women of this practice were actually very honoured people, and Walter Trail Dennison writes of them that the women of this class were skilled in medicinal and surgery, in dreams, in foresight and second sight, and in forestalling the evil influence of witchcraft. Such women were looked upon with a kind of holy respect. And he said that they were said to possess all the supernatural wisdom and some of the supernatural power without any of the malevolent spirits of witches. So this really is the very definition of a wise woman. So in Britain, especially on the east coast of Britain, the area that had been inhabited by the Anglo-Saxons and later by the Danes, the practice of the cunning man or woman continued on, very much undisturbed by authorities. It was considered very remote, and in the areas called the Fenlands, it was very difficult to traverse, and so in many ways they were unbothered by civilization and left to their own devices much later into this modern era than many other parts of the country were. And in these Fenlands there is a lot of record of cunning men and women who had practices. And in Cornwall there were also cunning men and women, but they were more likely to be called pellers. And of course over the rest of the country too. It has to be said that some of these people were actually con artists, practitioners of what you would call snakeskin oil, peddlers of old charms and tricksters, really. On the other hand, some had such powers that it was difficult to believe and could only be put down to the use of magic. And one of these strange powers was the art of horse whispering. Now, the art of horse whispering was passed along by a guild called the Society of the Horseman's Word, or the Society of the Horseman's Word and Grip. Now, Nigel Pennick tells of this in his book Witchcraft and Secret Societies of Rural England. And he recounts how the secret of horse whispering was passed on through an initiation, where an initiate would be summoned by something like a horse's hair sent in an envelope to a certain place. And when he arrived there, he would be accosted, blindfolded, and taken to usually a barn or a secret unknown place, where he was initiated into the horseman's word. Most often he had to swear to somebody who had been dressed up as the devil, or Old Clootie as one of his nicknames was. And he must not break his word on pain of death. It is said that the oath is taken neither sitting, walking or swinging, lying, flying, standing, neither clothed or unclothed, boots on or boots off, or blind. And as part of the ritual, a noose is put around the man's neck, although it is not attached to a beam, it is actually just a symbolic noose. And the promise is that if he breaks his oath, he will be punished by hanging and by death. So as part of the secret initiation, a word, a sacred word, is passed on to the horsemen, which will enable them to have power over horses. And he must swear never to impart this word to anyone on pain of death. Now, in the earlier 20th century, some people did break their oath, and pass on some of the secrets of the Horsemen's Guild. And we can therefore find out that the secret word that had been passed on in the Fenlands and in England, this word was sic jubeo, which is Latin for I command. It was said that in Scotland the word was one or both in one, although some claimed that this word was known in England before it travelled to Scotland. But it was not so much the word as the power that the word had been bestowed in by being passed on by this character who was known as the Devil or Old Clootie. And the word was passed on while gripping the Devil's hand. And so the order of the Horseman's word and grip was also a way of passing on a secret handshake. And of course we know this from Freemasonry, but every guild would be able to recognise each other through such acts as secret handshakes or secret conversation starters. One of these was claimed to be, "Have you met the devil?" And if you said you hadn't met the devil, obviously you had not been initiated into this secret society. It was said that this secret word had been passed on to the guild by a gypsy who had it passed on to him through oral and hereditary tradition. So many folk charms used Latin or words that sounded like Latin, and this may be part of the magic of the spoken language. It may also have been used to seem quite impressive, as though you were the recipient of some magical and esoteric alchemical formulations. And it must be said that many a showman used these Latin phrases to seem credible and to seem knowledgeable. It was also said that some of these phrases sounded Latin and sounded like another language, such as one such charm, which was to be initiated into folk witchcraft by speaking the Lord's Prayer backwards. And if you put all the letters of the Lord's Prayer backwards, you can derive some sort of Latin sounding incantation. And this was said to actually undo the conditioning of being brought into a world of a Christian belief, so that you could escape the dogma of Christianity into which you were born. The figure of the devil was also quite common in folk magic, and here we must not really see him as the devil, which is actually a Christian concept of an earlier god. So in fact he is the horned god, and he has many nicknames like Old Nick or Old Clootie. And so it would seem that swearing to the devil was in fact a part of traditional folk magic. But along with these initiations came formidable and awesome skills of magic, some of which could be quite frightening. And one of these skills was the art of stopping horses. Now it was said that some old women had the art of stopping horses, and there are many tales of horses who would not pass by an old woman's cottage but would stop still, dead still, and could not be coaxed into moving until the old woman had come out and spoke to them or patted them or said a secret word to them, in which they carried on. So we have these recordings of these tales, mainly from the Fenlands and recorded in Nigel Pennick's book, some of which I will recite to you here. So there's one old tale of, in 1927, in Upwood in Huntingdonshire, tells how a farmer's wagon stopped suddenly and would not move until an old woman came out of the house and picked up a straw from the road and moved it to one side, and on this the horse and the cart was able to move on again. Now this is an old magic of charming a straw to block a passage, and obviously this was something the old woman was practicing her magic with to see whether the straw would work. And so with the laying on of a straw across the path, you could stop someone from proceeding along that path, especially an animal or especially a horse. But many such tales were recounted even into the earlier 20th century. So one tale was told of a famous cunning woman called Mary Atkin, and it was said that one of her lodgers was disgruntled with her one morning and had thrown his burnt breakfast in her face, at which she turned to him and she said, "Oh, you think you're big now, but just wait till your horses get to the top of Cowbank and then you will be sorry." And so he went out on his business, and as she promised, when the horses reached the top of this place called Cowbank, they stopped and sweated and shuddered and would not move any further. And they stood there until somebody went back to Mary Atkin to ask for her forgiveness and beg her to lift the curse. And when this man returned, the horses truly just moved along as if there was never any problem. So a similar story is told of a blacksmith in Bourne in Cambridgeshire, and he was called George Kirk, and he was the blacksmith in the earlier 20th century there. And one story says how he decided to have revenge on a farmer who had been going around accusing people of theft. And so George Kirk decided to teach this man a lesson. And so what happened one day was, as the farmer's horse and cart were passing the forge, George Kirk is said to have turned towards the road and placed a handkerchief against his nose and then dropped it. And with this action, the horse stopped still and would not move. And it's said and recorded that the horse stayed there from 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. and nothing could coax that horse to go anywhere. And then at 5 p.m. George Kirk walked up to the horse, patted him on the neck, and the horse rode along as if nothing was amiss. And this was recorded by witnesses and in memoirs, and so we have a very late record of these magical practices. These cunning men and women were said to believe in ages where we consider ourselves quite logical and not really driven by fear or superstition. So it was said that this man George Kirk had the use of a frog bone to perform his magic, and the use of a toad or a frog bone was linked to the magical horse whispering guilds. Now people who had the frog or toad bone were called toadmen or toad women, but it was said that it was quite a responsibility to be a toad man or a toad woman. In fact, many people had been driven mad by the power of this magic, or who had committed suicide because the responsibility was too difficult to bear. But it was told that the rites to acquire a toad bone, there were different rites, but they had similar themes. They were quite dark, as we would consider magic today, and mainly they would kill a frog or a toad, which is not something I would recommend in any way to people who want power today. It's quite dark, but they would trap a toad or trap a frog. Many various traditions of how they would gain a toad skeleton. They would put it in an anthill until the ants had eaten all the flesh, and then they would take the bones to a stream on a full moon or on St. Mark's Eve, and they would throw the skeleton into the stream and see which bone floated towards them downstream, and then they would take this as their magical toad bone or frog bone. Other practitioners just kept a frog or toad bone in a special place, such as a locket, and the possession of this bone was said to give them power. But furthermore, it was said that after 3 days the power would be bestowed on the initiate by the devil himself. So this would sound like a similar rite to the rite of the horseman's word, where an initiate was taken to a secret place and the head of an order, who would be dressed as a devil, would impart some knowledge or skill or magic to them. So we have some records of people who had powers by use of this toad bone, and mainly we have the memoirs of a farm worker on the Fens who wrote a memoir called 60 Years of Fenman, and he recorded that he worked with a toadman in 1911, and he said of this man that he was able to throw open locked doors by throwing his cap at the latch. There was also another story written in 1930s of a witness who encountered this terrible story of a Norfolk man who had rested his walking stick against a wall and then beckoned it to him, at which the walking stick came and actually flew to him, came to him as he commanded. This terrified witness later discovered that the man was a toadman and who had use of a toad bone. It can also be said that a horseman's stick is a powerful tool that had magical powers and had been anointed with secret substances and oils. So many of these cunning men and women had powers that had been witnessed and recorded, and quite late into the 20th century. So many of these people had powers that had been recorded well into the 20th century, and it was said that the power of a toad bone was particularly awesome, and people were afraid of it. There was the saying that somebody had put a bone on them came from the power of this frog or toad bone. There was also the saying that they had been tudded, which means that somebody had bewitched them. So one of these powers of the cunning man or the cunning woman was the art of prophecy, and of course one of the most famous of these cunning people was old Mother Shipton. And she made prophecies that were recorded after her death, that were spoken in rhyme but were said quite often to come true. Now, many of these prophecies have been attributed to old Mother Shipton, though she never actually said them. So she never predicted the end of the world in any particular year. The year usually changes depending on who's telling the story. And neither did she predict carriages that went without horses, or iron boats that sailed on water. In fact, these were made up by a journalist and what you might call clickbait in the late 19th century to sell newspapers. But she did make some prophecies that came true about Henry VIII and his reign and the dissolution of the monasteries, and the prediction that she made on that case went: "When the cow doth ride the bull, then, priest, beware the skull, and when the lower shrubs do fall, the great trees quickly follow shall. The metered peacock's lofty cry shall to his master be a guide, and one great court to pass shall bring what was never done by any king. The poor shall grieve to see that day, and who did feast must fast and pray. Fate so decreed that overthrow, riches brought pride, and pride brought woe." Here we can see that the heraldry of Henry VIII was the cow and Anne Boleyn was the bull. And so this speaks of the marriage of Henry VIII to Anne Boleyn, which brought about the overthrow of the monasteries. The metered peacock was said to be Thomas Wolsey, who had grown through the ranks from a son of a baker to the most influential friend and advisor to the king. Another prediction made by Mother Shipton was: "Before Ousebridge and Trinity Church meet, what was built in the day shall fall in the night, till the highest stone in the church be the lowest stone of the bridge." And this came true shortly after she made the prediction, where a storm hit York and it tumbled the steeple of St Trinity's Church and it washed out the bridge. So they truly did use the church steeple stones as the foundations of the bridge. So even today, old Mother Shipton is memorialised in the cave, which is famous. And it was the cave in which she was born and in which she later lived. She was a renowned herbalist and healer, and her reputation grew as such, so that people would travel for miles to go and see old Mother Shipton for her healing and prophecies. And even now, visitors still continue to visit the cave and its petrifying well. And it has such properties so that anything that you put in the cave will be covered in mineral deposits until it is turned to stone. So even now it's seen as a most magical place and as the most magical cave. So her fame was great, so great that even Henry VIII had heard of her, and he wrote in a letter calling her the Witch of York. Many of her prophecies were written down after her death, but they were distinctly prophetic and wise, and her reputation was such that she was a very honoured prophetess and healer. So many charms and spells performed by cunning men and women had elements of both Christian theology and earlier pagan and heathen religion. And so one story goes of the renowned healer of already mentioned Mary Atkin, who had a cure when the ague came to the Fens in the 1850s. She refused to use conventional medicine, saying that she had a better cure for all those ills. And her cure was to hammer 3 horseshoes to the foot of the sick patient's bed with a charm. And the charm was recorded, And what she did was, as she nailed through the shoes, she would repeat this chant, which went, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, nail the devil to this post. Thrice I smite with holy crock, with this mell I thrice do knock, one for God and one for Wad and one for Lock. Now the mention of Wad and Lock may actually refer to Woden and Loki, and in many ways this is reminiscent of the 9 herb charms, which also invokes the healing of both Christ and Woden. And so we can see some very old remnants of heathen religions in these charms that mix Christianity with early pagan practices. So many folk magic practices seem to be a combination of a herb and charm magic, and this seems to be a direct inheritance from the Anglo-Saxons. It's also true that many of these practices were passed on through secret initiations and secret practitioners and groups of practitioners. And so many people sort of say that traditional witchcraft died out and was reinvented by romantics sometime last century. They might actually be denying that in some areas of rural England these traditions may actually be centuries and centuries old and still bear that imprint of Anglo-Saxon and pagan and heathen belief. So these folk magicians were the herbalists and the healers and the fortune tellers, and they carried on a oral tradition, one in fact that we get much of our modern medicine from. So these green doctors and these herbalists had a wealth of knowledge and learning. And one example of this was in the late 18th century, a doctor named William Withering was asked to treat a patient who had severe heart failure, and he had found her case incurable. But it later came to his knowledge that the woman had made a recovery after visiting a local herbal healer or a cunning woman. And this local Shropshire cunning woman was called Mrs. Hutton. And she had given the patient a drink with 20 herbs in it. And Mr. William Witherington later, having studied these herbs, had noticed that it was the property of foxglove that must have been the active ingredient that had helped the heart condition. And so now we still use foxglove to treat these heart conditions in patients. And so the cunning people had been the salvation of poor folk and village people for many, many years, who had come to these people for healing and for justice and for white magic and spell. Even today you will find gypsies who will travel around and sell lucky charms and spells and do fortunes. And these are the remnants of the cunning folk and the magical practitioners we have today. And there's not many people who would turn a gypsy away from their doorstep empty-handed. And perhaps we've inherited this awe or this respect or this fear of their magical arts and their secret practices. So there will always be people with special skills that are considered beyond the norm, people who say they can use magic charms, people who have unexplained powers and may be considered eerie or odd. But perhaps this power is our birthright and one that is being kept secret from us, something that we can learn, something that can be passed on from generation to generation. And so perhaps the art of the cunning man and woman never has been and never will be dead and extinct. Perhaps it's something that will still continue on even into the next centuries. So thank you for listening. If you want any more information on these subjects, I would recommend the books Witchcraft and Secret Societies in Rural England by Nigel Pennick, and Folk Witchcraft by Roger Horne. If you've got any comments, please add them in the box below. Thank you for liking and subscribing and sharing, and I hope to speak to you all again soon. Cheers, bye.